Okay, hello again. Let me welcome you to the second half of the course. And up to this point, we've looked at a lot of different kinds of things. We've sort of, and I don't want to review that. I don't want to start the second half by really doing anything like a review. But if you recall, we ended by looking at the growth of um, sort of empires, large scale empires, uh, in the examples of the Assyrian dynasty, followed by the Persian dynasty, the Assyrian Empire, followed by the Persian Empire, both more or less centered on the region that extends from Egypt through Mesopotamia, and in the case of the Persian Empire, will extend virtually up almost to the borders with India as it becomes a truly massive empire, if you will. So we're looking at now the Mediterranean, and of course it is connected with what we've been talking about before, but it has its own sort of period of initial growth and development, and it will reflect the fact that the geography of the region, after all, it is a sea, an inland sea that's then connected to the ocean, and will be then the basis for the growth of Greek civilization, Carthaginian civilization, later the Roman civilization, and moving on beyond that, right, into the Muslim civilization, so that indeed it will become sort of a central focus of the growth of civilization that will begin here with the fact that the magnetic appeal of the Mesopotamian region that we've already seen in the growth of the Indus River Valley civilization, which we've gone over and which sort of suggest the emergence of a civilization that is dedicated to commerce and trade. And indeed, archaeologists have discovered clear evidence of trade with Mesopotamia. So you could already see in the year 2500 BC how the wealth and power of the city states in that region, along with Egypt, could have something like a magnetic appeal and create a civilization that's a spin off and unique and different in its own right, but that is tied to commerce and trade with Mesopotamia. So we've already seen this possibility of a spin-off of sorts. Now we're looking at a spin-off in another direction, where indeed the power and the appeal and the desire of these growing centers of civilization in the Mesopotamian region will have an appeal then, an attraction to peoples in the Mediterranean region itself to engage in commerce and trade back with the empires along the coast, be they either Egypt or, on the other hand, Mesopotamia. Now, so we're looking at a growth of a new kind of civilization that emerges from commerce and trade with Mesopotamia. But given the geographical constraints, that you will, they're both constraints, but they're perhaps benefits as well. I mean, could you look at the Mediterranean as a constraint? Well, it's a constraint in the sense that you don't have um, a landmass large enough to then create a single coherent um, political organization. And it won't be indeed until the Romans come along that you are able to then create this single construct, which is a Roman Empire, that looks at the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, RC, CR, Nuestro Mar in Spanish, Notre Mer in French, Mare Nostrum in Latin, but that's not going to come for a good 2,000 years, right? So what we first have here are the growth of agricultural settlements in different areas that create towns, that create systems of local polities, political organizations that link that are linked together, one town with another, not by any overarching political control or power, but by participating in a common culture and in the trade and commerce that is at the base of this. So we will see then the growth of towns that are trading centers in different islands in the Aegean. Now, the first group to do this is the Minoans. And Minoan civilization is perhaps centered on the island of Crete, where archaeologists have uncovered the city of Knossos. Okay, now let me see. So on page 114, there is an artist reconstruction of the palace complex at Knossos, which is, if this is what it really was a rather impressive city for the time with, not any one single monumental architecture per se, but the whole complex is almost like an example of monumental architecture, right? With buildings that are scaled up along the way, suggesting something that we have seen already in the Indus River Valley, where artisans and workers in certain quarters around the way, and then the further up high you get, the larger the buildings get, the more impressive the internal structure of the buildings are. And so you get this sense of the growth of wealth and social classes there in this particular place, right? But again, the geographical diversity of the region would have made it hard for a group like the group in Knossos to exercise hegemony, control over other outlying regions. And indeed, there doesn't seem to be a level of sort of competition, just like at the start with the Mesopotamian, the Sumerian city-states, that at the start were not walled, were sort of, each one was dedicated to an individual god, and they seemed to coexist rather easily with one another. Each one of the city-states had its surrounding area of agricultural land that helped feed the specialist in the city, mostly the priestly class. Later, a political class and a king will arise out of that. And so we see here something similar happening with the Minoans. But here in the case of the Minoans, it's on separate islands, right? And so the Minoan society has developed the seagoing craft that will enable them to go out and engage in trade with outlying areas. But each of the individual city-states here, to the extent that they are states, it's less clear that they were states rather than just kind of independent entities. So in that case, you could say they were similar to city-states, but they don't exercise control over a surrounding area. They are really dedicated to commerce and trade. Um, Now, Minoan society, if we look at the palace complex in Knossos on the island of Crete, um, was, um, if you will, and I've asked you to look at the picture on page 114. One of the interesting aspects of that palace complex is there's no defensive structure of fortification, there's no walls. It is an open city. And maybe in the situation that at that point in time, no one had developed a navy that could have transported troops there to attack them, conquer them, and perhaps it might not have been necessary. The text suggests that this lack of defensive fortifications at a place like Knossos suggests a degree of confidence. They're just in charge of things very much, right? There is then on the neighboring island of Santorini, which, let me see, where is this in my notes? Okay, here. Okay, let me go take a step back and look at it in a broader sense as expected for a commercial society. They had systems of writing and indeed scribes, a class of professional writers, as we might expect from what we saw in Mesopotamia with the growth of cuneiform writing, a system that was first designed to keep track of commercial transactions. They So they did have something now. The Minoans, this first group, that's probably there maybe the same time as the Indus River Valley begins to arise in commerce and trade, that may have begun to appear around 2500 BC or perhaps somewhat after that, right? So they have developed a writing system which we refer to today as a linear A. I'll get to that in a second. When we dig down deeper, as we try and do by, the archaeologists, okay, so they have a writing system. The problem is we haven't been able to decipher it. So we actually don't even know what language they spoke, which is kind of the same challenge we have with the Sumerians. We're not entirely sure where they're from because we really don't know what their language is. And even though we have deciphered cuneiform as a writing system, it's hard to apply it to a language that we don't know. It's only when it was transposed to Semitic languages did it really become obvious that this was truly a writing system that had emerged out of Sumeria. Well, here in the Minoan civilization, we have a writing system that we have not been able to decipher. I'll come back to that in a second. When we look at religion here, and religion has been important in all of this, we really don't see, just as we didn't really see a clear sort of strategic importance of religion in the Indus River Valley. So both of those two examples, the Indus River Valley and the Minoan society, as it spread over different islands in the Mediterranean, particularly in the Aegean region, both of these seem to have some indications of religious practices, but no temples, no major religious structures. This is certainly the case now in Knossos, that there is no sort of ziggurat dominating the stage, right? That idea of the city was founded as the home of the gods and this kind of a thing. There are statues of a female deity that suggest some sort of belief and worship, but no temples. And if you have no temples, then you have no priestly class to serve the gods, as you had in Mesopotamia, but also in Egypt as well. So you don't have this here, right? In the 20th century, they discovered Knossos, and then later on in the century, they then discovered another trading center on the island of Thera, in the Greek Thera and the Italian Santorini. I'm kind of used to calling it Santorini because I went there from Italy, so I bought a ticket to Santorini. An obvious example of a trading city, which is also which is different in this regard from Knossos because it's not centered on a palace complex, and so it seems to be a city dedicated to commerce and trade that may have had certain relations with the ruler in Knossos, but it appears to have been an independent spin-off of the Minoan society. And the island of Santorini is a fascinating place. It's an island that literally has been cut in half, that there was a volcano right up the middle that exploded and literally blew away half of the island. And if you go there, and people go there on tourist cruises in the Mediterranean, and they kind of pull up there, and you pull next to this island, and there is this blackened wall of rock that rises up 15 stories in the air, 20 stories in the air. In fact, you can stand on it and look down on one of these huge, tourist vessels that go by that are themselves quite high, right? 10 stories high, but you can look down on them, right? And indeed, when I was there, I went to visit the home of a colleague of mine who was teaching with me in Saudi Arabia and who had bought a cave that on this sort of side of the mountain like this, the Greeks have gone in and excavated in and built apartments in the rock there. And this friend of mine had bought it, and you could sit on the front porch overlooking the Mediterranean, which was maybe 15 stories below you, right? You couldn't really dive from there down to the sea, but you could. There was sort of like steps in the rocks where you could go down and go swimming and then come back up again. When this friend of mine arrived after a month's vacation back there, he had lost like 10 pounds and looked buff just from going up and down and swimming every day, right? On the island, then, they discovered this marvelous city that had been, Akrotiri is the name that they've given it in Greek, that was apparently buried in ashes. And in the 20th century, farmers began coming across stuff, and Greece being what it is, right, and its ancient history. Archaeologists came in and quickly discovered a extremely well-preserved city that had been bombarded by ashes and other kinds of things in the explosion, but then had been buried. and perfectly preserved, such that there are farmhouses, not even farmhouses, villas, right? Luxurious houses in the countryside with frescoes on the wall. And indeed, on page, I thought I wrote it down here. Okay, so it's maybe 112, no, 116. A beautiful image from the wall there that seems to be a portrait of the major city itself of Akrotiri, in the time of its glory, shall we say. And you can see, levels of houses, people on the roofs, different neighborhoods and social class differences. It's and the whole area around it with wild animals in the hills and things like that, and then dolphins in the water. It's a fascinating view into the city and the time. But what's also fascinating are the boats that they have that seem to be carrying, and so the artist portrayed a number, I think there's two, separate vessels with oars, and there's a lot of information there. So when we discovered this, and they went in and they discovered that this was a place with some really nice houses that had internal plumbing, running water, toilets that worked, things like that. What else did they find? The paintings on the wall would certainly suggest wealth and leisure and luxury, right? Now, this phenomena then of the spread of a culture in this region prefigures, in a sense, what we're going to see with the Greeks, who will come here and then sort of spread out and create a process of colonization in the region around them. And in that regard, certainly the fact that Knossos has no defensive fortifications will be significant, because what will happen is around the year 1900, which corresponds very closely to the arrival of the Aryans into northern India, what today is northern India, northern Pakistan, and then begin the descent into the Indus River Valley. And they were Aryans, Indo-European speakers. Remember, they have the language Sanskrit, which will be the language of their sacred books, their Bible, if you will. We now see the arrival of other Indo-European speakers in the form of the Greeks. And these early Greeks, the first example of Greeks arriving into the peninsula that will become Greece and is Greece today, we call them Mycenaeans. And they speak a form of Greek, an earlier form of Greek, and they will have a writing system, Linear B. Now, I mentioned Linear A for the writing systems of the Minoans. Linear B uses a similar form of writing. The symbols for the writing system are very similar to the systems. So we believe that they took it from the Minoans, who may have been influenced by the Phoenicians, but we're not entirely sure. In any case, what happened with Linear B, which after all is an ancient form of Greek, which precedes the writings of Homer by 1,500 years, something like, no, by about 500, 700, 800 years prior to that, right? And consider where English was 700 years ago with Chaucer, where if you hear someone read you Chaucer today, or Beowulf for that matter, you can hardly understand it. In any case, how were we able to decipher linear B? Um, the same way we were able to decipher, and I mean exactly the same way that we were able to decipher um, hieroglyphics in Egypt. And I think I probably mentioned this to you, the Rosetta Stone, that story about Napoleon and his troops being in Egypt during the Napoleonic Wars, fighting the British and trying to prevent the British from being able to go to India. And they're getting ready for a battle with a contingent of British troops that are marching towards them. And the soldiers are making a fortification in the street by taking stones and, sort of building up so that they can, have protection and fire at the soldiers as they come. And they turn over a stone, and the stone has three separate writings on them. The first one is hieroglyphics. The second one is Greek from the 4th century, Greek as we know it, right? And the third one was this mysterious system of writing, but no one knew, right? They were then able to decipher the um, the hieroglyphics, and they turned around and they deciphered the third line, which proved to be Linear B, the Mycenaean language, right? And so we've been able to decipher that. We haven't been able to decipher Linear A from the Minoans. And so, there are still plenty of mysteries out there for future historians to get involved in, linguists, historians, like a lot of stuff to be done anyway, right? So the Mycenaeans will arrive somewhere around 2000 BC, maybe 1900 BC into 1800, right? And they come in groups just like they did in northern India. They're not. It's not a massive invasion. It's the arrival of people who maybe are cattle herders, but they also have something of a warrior ethos, and they've got swords with them and other kinds of things, right? And they begin settling in what today is Greece, and then gradually move into the islands. They make contact with the Minoans, and ultimately they will begin engaging in trade in the Mediterranean, begin building boats and developing, maritime skills. And apparently they invade and take over Knossos. They invade the island of Crete and the other islands, and so the Greeks come in and literally replace the Minoans, who seem to disappear eventually from that region and from history and other things, while the Mycenaeans are growing and developing kingdoms in different city states in the region. And then around 1200, there is a climate crisis again, climate change, which is going to impact on the major centers of Mesopotamia and Egypt, which is to say, the Mycenaeans had replaced the Minoans as the traders in the region, and suddenly the region is no longer trading. And so you have what are called the Dark Ages from 1200 to 800. Begins around 1200, but really 1100 to 800 is the true Dark Ages, where the glory days, that you see portrayed in the war, in the Trojan Wars, that civilization where you have kings and trade and palaces and things like that begins to collapse, and you enter into a dark age. But during that same period of time, between 1200 and 800, Greeks continue to arrive in the region that is Greek, other Greeks. Other Greek speakers begin to arrive in that region, and so you begin to get more Greek speakers moving in, developing new, so that by the year 800, things sort of gel again and come back in. But now there's new blood and new enthusiasm. New Greek city states have been formed, right? Um, so Egypt, Mesopotamia begin to become, if you will, magnets for growth. You get the emergence of Greek city states as trading centers again. As commerce picks up in the Mediterranean region, they will reestablish their maritime skills, build boats. Um, this is the period of time after 800, about 750, when we have the figure of Homer. Now, there is some debate historically whether Homer is a name that's given or whether it was indeed an individual poet. But Homer is certainly, and I have no reason to believe one way or the other, right? So I accept the idea that Homer was indeed a poet. Even if he was a poet, he dealt with pre existing legends, oral traditions that were part of the Greek culture. He will then put them together in the two great masterpieces that are at the heart of Hellenic Greek culture, which is the Iliad and the Odyssey. I don't know if any of you read them. If you did, you might have been forced to read parts of them in high school. I think you're probably too young to appreciate it in high school, right? And probably not a good thing to make people read it in high school, because then they don't like it later and they can't come back to it later. Or maybe they will when they're 35 years old and they pick it up and get a good translation and say, hey, this is cool stuff, right? But the Iliad is the story of the end of the fighting that occurred in the Trojan Wars, where the Prince of Troy steals the wife of one of the kings on the mainland. Troy is today located in what would be Turkey, Anatolia. And that king gathers together his allies and they invade. And they literally spend 10 years trying to penetrate the defenses of Troy, and they're not able to. This is the famous story of the Trojan horse. They appear to have decided to give up and leave a gift, right? And of course, the gift is this big wooden horse, which is hollow inside, which contains maybe 8 or 10 men who, the Trojans go out and wheel it back into, and proceed to have an orgy. And, they've been under siege for 10 years. And so they're out drinking and, partying, these kinds of things. And, like 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, when things have died down, the little door underneath opens up and these Trojan warriors come out, kill the 2 guards on the gate, I think. In any case, they then have flares because all of the boats that carried all the soldiers have seemingly disappeared, and they have flares to show that the gates will be open, right? So the boats come back into shore, the men get off, and right at the first dawn, they penetrate the city and proceed to, rape, pillage, and do all those wonderful things, right? And that's the Iliad, and then out of that will come the Odyssey, which is Odysseus' return home and his voyages along the way. The Cyclops with one eyes, the sirens who sing to them and, seem to mystify, all of the adventures that he and his men have on the way back. And then his wife, anyway, they're kind of cool stories, but the quality of the writing and the vision and the poetic skill is extraordinary, to say the least. And they become foundational pieces for Greek culture. Indeed, Alexander the Great, and I asked you to look at a movie that gives you an overview of his life and his sense of destiny and things like that, had been truly impressed by the Iliad as a young man, and wanted to be like Achilles, the great warrior, this kind of a thing. And so it is a foundational piece, and it's still part of Western civilization and culture today. I don't think we read it as much as people did maybe 100, 150, 200 years ago. In any case, this is around the year 750. And so Greek commerce begins to grow, the city-states begin to grow, and you enter into a period of colonization in which the initial city-states that have gotten large send out parties to colonize and develop new independent city-states. And what you then get is, and I would like you to look at the map on page 192, which is a very nice map. You see how they have spread all around the coastal region of, the Peloponnesian Peninsula, the area that is Greece, but the coast of Turkey, up into all the way around the Black Sea. And of course, each of these individual city-states that go there then engage in commerce and trade with people in the interior. And each region then specializes in distinctive products that are desired on this emergent, sort of localized but global marketplace that's developing there, right? Eventually, by the year 499, the Greek city-states will feel strong enough to revolt against the Persian Empire that we've seen has grown strong in the meantime, with Cyrus the Great and then Darius, right? And has conquered parts of Anatolia, which contained, the residues of places like Troy and other city-states that had been built by the Greeks there. And those Greeks requested assistance from their fellow Greeks. And out of this will grow a series of Persian wars. And out of these Persian wars, in which the Greeks are able to, they certainly not able at that point in time during the 400s, they're not able to conquer the Persian Empire, but they are able to hold their own. And the Greeks, the Persians will come in and indeed will, the Athenians abandon Athens and the Persians come in and seemingly trash Athens. And they're able to, with their combination of the infantry skills, particularly of the Spartans, together with the maritime skills of the Athenians, are able to drive the Persians back out. Out of this will come something called the Delian League, in which the city-states kind of come together to pledge allegiance to one another. It's kind of like a mutual defense system like NATO after World War II, where we have the Soviet Union, the threat of the Soviet Union, and the European countries with the United States get together and sign a mutual defense pact, such that if one country is attacked, others will come to their defense. That being said, right, out of this war, the Persian Wars, will come two major cities that I just mentioned, Athens and Sparta, who will become the leaders in terms of Greek culture and Greek civilization. More specifically, Athens than Sparta, but after all, Sparta is a leader in warfare. And these are things that we will look at in our next lecture. So, thank you.